Okay, I'll hand over to our guest speaker, Kate Chandler. Kate, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi everyone, thanks Emma Jane. I've minimized you all now, so if you can't hear me or you can't see anything, then please let me know. Or if there's anything in the chat, I won't be able to see it. So do say if anything's going horribly wrong, but I hope it won't. So anyway, thank you so much for having me here this evening. My name's Kate. I'm the Communities and Engagement Pollinator Officer for the National Biodiversity Data Centre. And I work in particular on the All Island Pollinator Plan. And for those of you who don't know, the All Island Pollinator Plan is a framework bringing together different sectors across the island of Ireland to create a landscape where pollinators can survive and thrive. And I'm going to share some practical recommendations on how you might help biodiversity in your community today, and pollinators in particular. And I'm also going to speak about work already happening in communities with different initiatives with councils and other organisations like the Tidy Towns and the GAA. So I'll be speaking a little bit about our advice in those contexts because it does differ slightly sometimes depending on the sector. And I'm also going to talk a bit about how you might engage with other groups within your community and your council to have greater impact. And as I go through the slides, I'm going to be talking about several different resources. Everything I'm going to mention will be available to download for free on our website, pollinators.ie. So if you haven't yet visited that and explored it, go on there. There's loads of free resources that you can download on there. But before I go into any of that, I just want to step back a bit and ask what are our pollinators? Who are they on the island of Ireland? And why are we focused on this particular group of insects? And there are a couple of answers to that question. Pollinators, as you know, transfer pollen between plants, which helps the plants reproduce. And on the island of Ireland, we have over 100 different species of bees. It's mainly bees that pollinate on the island of Ireland, also hoverflies and to a lesser extent, moths and butterflies, other insects. But there are over 100 different types of wild bee. One of those is our native honeybee. So they live in hives and they often looked after by beekeepers. Then about 20% are bumblebees, like this one in the middle here. So they're the ones that they're the fluffy big ones. They're quite hard to miss. They live in colonies with other bumblebees. But 80% of them, so the vast majority of our bees in Ireland, are a group of bees that we call solitary bees. And they often don't look like bees at all. They might look like flies or wasps. Some of them, if you've ever made a bee hotel or an insect hotel, the bees using that will be a small group of solitary bees called cavity nesting bees. But most solitary bees actually make their nests in tunnels in the ground, in bare soil. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But it's these guys, it's the bumblebees and the solitary bees that are really in trouble. We call these our wild bees. And that just gives you a little bit of a sense of the sheer number of how many different types there are. So these are two posters that are available to download for free on our website, just to give you an idea of how many different bees we have in Ireland. And the problem is that, unfortunately, 1/3 of our bee species is threatened with extinction. And this is mainly because we have drastically reduced the habitats that provide them with food and safe nesting sites. Also because of pests and diseases, pesticides, and climate change. On the island of Ireland, about 78% of our wild plants are pollinated by insects. Most of the pollination is carried out by wild bees. And just looking at that on the global scale, then globally, about 100 crops provide about 90% of the world's food. And of these, 71 are pollinated by bees. So we rely hugely on pollinators for our own food supply, as well as the health of our natural environment and all the other insects, birds and mammals that are connected to that. And of course, and I don't think this is said often enough, these creatures deserve a landscape that supports them for their own sake. But the good news is there are some very simple things we can do to help them. And before I move on to our top recommendations, this is our local communities guideline for actions to help pollinators. So if you want to start taking action for pollinators in your community, this is a really good place to start because it goes into everything I'm going to talk about in much more detail. You can download it for free on our website. And we've got a new version launching in spring next year, which will include a pollinator scoring system, which will help you, like a checklist, so you can go around your community and sort of assess how you're doing. So keep an eye out for that next year. But I'm going to move on now to our top 10 recommendations for helping pollinators. And the first of these, this won't surprise some of you, is don't mow, let it grow. And if you follow us on social media, you'll hear us banging on about this quite a lot. Some of you might have done no mow May or let it bloom June or reduced mowing throughout the summer, even better. And if you have, you'll know already that reducing mowing is one of the best things you can do to help pollinators. And the reason for this is, as we've seen, pollinators are struggling because of a loss of habitat. And in particular, the wildflowers that occur naturally in what we call species-rich grassland. And that includes a wide variety of native wildflowers and grasses that they have evolved alongside. So when you reduce mowing, you're giving these flowers a chance to pop up naturally. The seed bank is already there in the soil. You don't need to sow anything. It's already there. And reducing mowing gives them a chance to come up naturally over time. And I'm talking about flowers like dandelions, clovers, bird's foot trefoil. And there's a couple of different options for reducing mowing. You could create a short flowering meadow. So this is a cut every 4 to 6 weeks, starting in mid-April, which allows the first dandelions to come up. And that also later in the year allows clover to appear on a rotational basis. Or you could do a long flowering meadow, and that's a cut once a year in September, which allows the seeds to drop in August. And that can take a couple of years to fully establish, or even a few years, because at first the soil will be too fertile to support lots of wildflowers. So a really crucial step with this and creating a short flowering meadow is make sure when you do cut the grass, you remove the clippings. So they're not going back into the soil and increasing the soil fertility. You want that nutrient poor soil. What we're finding with the long flowering meadows is that, as wonderful as they are, they can create a bit of an intimidating level of grass growth in September. But what we have seen is some communities managing this by scything the grass. So this is Abbey Leak's Tidy Towns. They made an event out of it in Heritage Week. And I think with the support of the Lee Shofferley Wildlife Trust, got training in scything. And they made came up with a community event to come and have a haymaking day. So it's a very traditional low carbon way of cutting a meadow. And then the community helped pull the grass cuttings into haystacks. And then some other communities are also managing the resulting grass clippings by putting them in a community composter, so everyone can use the compost that comes out of that. So there's for every challenge, there's a solution, and often communities we're seeing are at the forefront of coming up with these. But whatever option you choose, the key thing is to make sure it's sustainable. And that means making sure you're using the right mowing regime in the right place, because it's not a one size fits all. We can't do the same thing everywhere because it just won't last, or it might not work. And you know yourselves, you're going to need to make sure that you're considering human needs in the spaces that you're choosing, and sometimes animal needs as well. Like here in Dublin, Brent geese, when they migrate, need very short grass to feed. So there are certain areas where it wouldn't be appropriate to let the grass grow long. So it's not as simple as doing the same thing everywhere. We need a variety of grass lengths and habitats to support biodiversity properly. And part of this is also about explaining what's happening, because meadows can look a bit messy towards the end of the summer and into the autumn and winter, which can lead to complaints, particularly in residential areas. And this can put a lot of pressure on councils. If they're getting a lot of complaints and negativity about grass growth, they might feel pressure to mow. So if you do have if council is doing a meadow in your area, and it's, make sure you're giving good feedback about it, because often they're used to getting the complaints, and that might then put the pressure on them to cut the grass, when actually the best thing to do is to keep going. So some councils and communities have had success in mowing paths through these areas. So the management is obviously deliberate. And that means the meadow can be enjoyed as well. And also using signage to explain that the area is being managed for pollinators. There was actually a study done in Tralee that showed communities or people in communities who maybe aren't too happy about long grass growth are far more likely to support it if they understand why it's happening, and they understand that it's taking place to help pollinators. So maybe that's where you can come in and help get that buy-in from as many people as possible. So there's that strong support for pollinator friendly actions. And just to show an example of where reduced mowing has worked really well in a community. So in Mayo, the Kilmaine Village Enhancement Group devised a short flowering meadow management plan for the village. So they did that by, when they cut the grass, they did it in 2 halves. So one half of the village was mown in the first fortnight of the month, and the remainder in the second fortnight, which made sure there was always something in a flower rather than mowing the whole lot at once. So you could change this to a 6-week rotation or a mixture depending on the space. But the principle is that when you're cutting, you're not doing everything at the same time. And they also raised the blade height on the mower, so they were sparing some of the low-lying flowers. And this picture is from Auburn Avenue in Castleknock. And we're all familiar with areas like this, particularly in urban areas. So they might not look like much on first glance, but I don't know if you can see that because the picture's quite blurry, but there are tons and tons of white clover growing there, just in that tiny little triangle of grass between driveways. So it just goes to show that small areas like this, even really small grassy areas, can make a big difference and help join the dots in our landscape. Then another recent example of where reduced mowing is being taken on is in South Dublin. So they've been rolling out a short flowering meadow trial across residential areas. And they're inviting residents' associations to request areas within their estates to be left as short flowering meadows. And they're creating a map with all these different areas as well, so they can help join the dots and decide which to manage in this way next. They're also managing quite a lot of long flowering meadows. And again, they're using signage to explain what's going on. And there's a QR code there linking to their biodiversity pages. So if you haven't done already, I would encourage you to look at the biodiversity pages on your council's website to get a feel for what they're doing at the moment. Lots of them have recently hired new biodiversity officers. So this work is really gaining pace, and it's a great time to engage with them directly on how you could get involved. These are some of the signage templates that you can download for free on our website. These are some new ones this year, which just delve into a little bit more depth on what appears when you mow less, and also what a meadow might look like at different times of year. And we've also got ones that you can edit to add your own website or QR code if you want to direct people onto a website, a further website. So those are all free to download on pollinators.ie. So I'm going to whiz swiftly on because I know we haven't got masses of time. The next recommendation is about protecting and creating native hedgerow. And this includes plants like hawthorn and blackthorn. They flower in spring. So they're a really important source of food for pollinators when they're emerging from hibernation, when there's not much else food around. So queen bumblebees emerge in early spring and they start to look for somewhere to nest, and they need access to thousands of flowers a day if they're going to be if they're going to be successful in completing their life cycle. So having this early food is vital. If you're managing a hedgerow, the key thing to remember is that blossom will only grow on older wood. So if it's being cut every year, that's going to be no good. We recommend leaving it at least 3 years before cutting. So on a 3-year rotation at the very least, to allow that blossom to emerge and let it grow into a natural A-shaped profile rather than cutting it into that boxy square shape that you often see. So in County Meath, Julianstown Community Gardens replaced this fence with a native hedgerow during council works. So the councils, I think they were laying pipes or something. They were doing some sort of work that required digging in this area. So they used that as an opportunity to add in a native hedgerow. And Woodstown in Dublin, they added hedgerow along the M50 to link with existing hedgerows down from the mountains. So they're creating an ecological corridor between down from the mountains. And hedgerows are a really great way of creating ecological corridors. And I'm sure you're familiar with that concept of joining the dots between different habitats in a landscape. And some councils are working on developing this already as part of their biodiversity action plans or their blue-green infrastructure strategies. There's a lot of work going on in various councils at the moment around mapping existing habitats with a view to joining the dots between them. And early next year, we're going to have a new resource on ecological corridors with advice for councils and communities. So keep an eye out for that as well. Along a similar line then, native trees and shrubs like willow and rowan and crabapple and holly, they also flower quite early in the year. So in the same way hedgerows are really important as that early source of food, trees are the same. And I don't need to tell you how important trees are generally for other organisms, for biodiversity, for carbon capture, and for the climate. So hugely important organisms. And you can plant a young tree in the autumn or the winter, or you can grow them from seed. And you can also get small varieties that are good for gardens or smaller spaces. But the three key things to remember with trees is make sure you're picking the right tree. So local provenance, native Irish trees are best rather than imported ones, because that prevents the spread of pests and diseases. And they'll also be blossoming at just the right time for to support our native pollinators. If you get trees or hedgerow plants that are sourced elsewhere on the continent, that even if it's the same species, they might bloom at a slightly different time, for instance, when the pollinators haven't emerged, so they're sort of out of joint. So it's really important to find local provenance ones if you can. Think about the right space. So what's going to happen to the tree in the future? How tall is it going to grow? Is it going to drop fruit that might cause problems? You know, you want to think about whether this tree, in the same way that with the meadows, whether this tree is going to be sustainable or if you're going to get loads of complaints in a few years' time and calls to cut it down. So you want to think about that, think about the tree's future and the right place as well. So lots of locations are already valuable habitats for biodiversity, and they're not necessarily the right place to plant trees. And it would be habitats like species-rich grassland, bogs, heathland, or sites with rare and protected species. So before starting any of this work, and this applies for all of these actions, it's really important to look around you and figure out what's already there, because chances are in your community there will already be habitats, however small, that are already providing a service for pollinators and biodiversity and need to be protected as a priority. So just some examples on tree planting. So in Monaghan, a couple of years ago, they ran a dispersed urban orchard project where they sourced local heritage apple trees and invited people in Monaghan to pick up fruit trees for a £5 in the local shopping centre. And anyone who bought a tree had to tell them exactly where they lived and commit to planting it there. And that allowed them to create a map then of where these apple trees were going around Monaghan town. And again, it goes back to that idea of ecological corridors and getting a sense of what's already there. So you're sort of joining the dots, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. You don't need to plant hundreds of trees, just a few can make a difference. And I'm sure you're familiar with organisations like pocket forests that work to plant trees in small spaces. Pesticides. So this next one's a really big one, and I don't need to tell you how important this is because I'm sure you're already aware. But pesticides are potent chemical cocktails which are designed to kill or harm, or have been found to kill, harm, and disorientate pollinators. So some of them have been found to prevent pollinators getting back to their nests. So one of the best things you can do for biodiversity generally is stop using them altogether. And if you buy plants at a garden centre, ask if they've been treated with chemicals, because even bee-friendly labelled plants might have been treated with pesticides. And part of this is about changing the way we view weeds, because often these plants are really important native wildflowers that our pollinators have evolved alongside. So this on the right here is a summary of records that were sent to us last year at the National Biodiversity Data Centre of bee sightings, which included information about what the bee was feeding on. So this is over 1,800 records that were sent to us last year. And that essentially allows us to build a list of top 10 bees' favourite food. And dandelions by far and away were number one on that list. There were more than double the number of sightings of bees on dandelions compared to the next plant down. So they are hugely important. I think Plant Life in the UK has a statistic that 8 dandelions provide the baseline nutrition for an adult bee's food for a day. So 8 dandelions is all it takes to keep an adult bee alive for a day. So I mean, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here, but they really are fantastic plants and should be protected. Sometimes herbicides are unavoidable for example, when you're trying to treat invasive species like Japanese knotweed, but generally avoid them altogether. And if you have to remove certain plants, avoid chemicals or do it by hand. There are quite a few trials going on at the moment into organic alternatives, and we're hoping to provide some more guidance on pesticide alternatives next year. The next one then is create nesting habitat. Most bees don't live in beehives. Wild pollinators tend to nest in long grass, in hedgerows, wild areas, dry stone walls, and even in the ground, as I mentioned earlier. So to make a nesting habitat for them can be as simple as scraping back some bare earth or leaving some areas to grow wild or the grass grow long. I don't know if you can see that there, but right in the middle of that picture, there's a common carder bee, and it's flying out of its nest there in long grass. Bumblebees tend to make their nests right on the surface of the ground in areas of long grass. And interestingly, bumblebees tend to forage within about 1 kilometre of their nest, and solitary bees only forage for food within a few hundred meters of their nest. So what that tells us is that it's really important to have a proximity between wherever the nest site is and a food source. And this is partly why they're struggling, because the habitat generally has become so depleted. But it's really important if you're establishing a nest site to make sure there's a food source nearby. There's a great example in Woodstown in Dublin of where sometimes actually nesting habitats are in quite unexpected places. They had scrambler tracks and dumped earth spoils in an area of their estate, which weren't intentional, and in some people's views weren't even ideal. But actually what they found was that that was a fantastic habitat for mining bees. So southeast facing bare earth, and I don't know whether you can see that, it's quite small, but there are some tiny little tunnels there in the earth as mining bee nests. Moving on then, pollinator friendly planting is another big one. And the first thing to say about this is that, as we've already seen, native plants are by far and away the best options for pollinators and biodiversity. But in the right places, like in gardens, balconies, pots, certain parts of parks, non-native or what we call ornamental plants can also play a role. And the key thing to bear in mind when choosing plants is that they have to be a good source of nectar and pollen. Popular plants like daffodils and tulips and begonias aren't good sources of nectar and pollen. Perennials are generally better than annuals. And what we suggest is that you try and choose plants that are going to flower between February and October at least. So that's generally the pollinator's life cycle. So herbs like rosemary and chives and thyme are great options. Bulbs like snowdrops and crocuses and grape hyacinth in the right places. We've got loads of lists on our website of plants that are particularly good for pollinators. These pages are from our guide that came out this year, Top 10 Pollinator Friendly Plants for Different Situations. And that has loads of different lists split into native and non-native, and includes information about when each plant is in flower, so you can plan for that year-long supply of pollen and nectar. And there's loads of examples of where communities have done amazing work around this. So in Abbey Leaks, again, they did an incredible edible planter project where they planted herbs in community planters and invited people to come and snip away at some of the herbs, whilst also providing a food source for pollinators. Clonmel ran a Bucket of Bulbs initiative with local schools, distributing pollinator-friendly bulbs to pupils in the local schools. And Mullingar Shamrock's GAA created a sensory garden with the Men's Sheds and Tidy Towns group. So sensory gardens, as I'm sure some of you have heard of, they're getting more and more popular. They're places where There are opportunities to connect with nature through the senses, and you can make these pollinator friendly by including pollinator friendly herbs and plants and flowers and fruit trees. So we've got a resource on how to do that on our website as well. So if you're looking for a bigger project, that might be something to get your teeth into. So the next three things are things you want to be a little bit wary of, and some of them might surprise you. First one of those is think twice about getting honeybee hives. And the first thing to say is that all pollinators are important and have a role to play. But what we're finding now, and what studies are showing, is that increasingly, if we have too many honeybee hives in the landscape, it's adding to, they're competing for food with our wild bees. So our one native honeybee that I mentioned earlier, fortunately, it's not currently in decline. But if we have too many honeybee hives in the landscape, they can add to the pressure on our wild pollinators. So if you want to get a honeybee hive to start a new hobby, fine, but don't do it necessarily as an action for biodiversity. And if you do get a hive, please get in touch with your local beekeeping association to learn how to keep healthy honeybees, because there's loads of them up and down the country, and they're doing fantastic work, and they'll be able to provide you with the best advice. The next thing to be careful of is wildflower seed mixes. And again, this might be surprising, but actually sowing wildflower seed mixes can be damaging to local biodiversity. The problem is there's no regulation over their content in Ireland. And studies have shown that many wildflower seed mixes contain non-native species, despite what the packet says, and can inadvertently introduce invasive species. And I guess crucially, they're not going to result in that all-important species-rich grassland that we saw earlier. The way to encourage that is to just reduce mowing, and it's far cheaper. So be careful with these. And if you do decide to sow wildflower seed mixes, keep them to garden settings and ensure they're native and of Irish origin. Alternatively, there is a way that you can collect seeds from local wildflowers, and we've got instructions on how to do that on our website. And several groups and councils are running ongoing seed harvesting projects. So they're getting a seed bank of locally sourced wildflowers. The next one then is avoid large bee hotels. So bee hotels provide nesting habitat for cavity nesting bees, so that type of solitary bee. If you see your bee hotel plugged up like that, that's great news, because it means someone's in residence. The bee has laid its eggs in there and has blocked it up. But if they're too big, they can attract predators and spread diseases. So we recommend keeping it no bigger than an average size bird box. And there are loads of other ways to create nesting habitats, which I've spoken about already. And there's guidelines on our website for that too. So I'm coming towards the end now. But our final recommendation, I suppose, and this will be second nature to you guys as activists, is working with others and spreading the word. And this is really key, I guess, to your work in particular, working with others and being the mouthpiece for biodiversity and climate action within your communities and beyond. And I'd say an essential first step when it comes to biodiversity and pollinators is to find out what's already going on in your community. On the right here, this is our online mapping system, Actions for Pollinators, which can be a really useful tool, because anybody can add a site on their community, a garden, a business, or a school, sports club, if they're managing it for pollinators. So you can go on that, zoom into your community and see who else is taking action for pollinators and what those actions are. So I've spoken, oh, sorry, this is just a zoom. This is an example of SNEAM on the Actions for Pollinators map. So each colour is a different type of site. So we've got local communities, got a faith community up here, businesses, gardens, schools. So and again, it kind of gives you a sense of where you can join the dots and where you might be able to work on developing more areas for pollinators and create that connected landscape. So councils then, I've spoken a little bit about councils already, but just to focus on them for a minute. As of this year, all 42 councils on the island of Ireland are officially signed up as council partners to the All Ireland Pollinator Plan. And that means that they've agreed to consider the recommendations of the pollinator plan when developing any policies, plans, or making management decisions. It means they've committed to carrying out evidence-based pollinator-friendly actions. And it means that they provide a report on their work to us every year, so we can keep track of what they're doing and help them knowledge share between them. And I think today we uploaded our council partner report for 2023. So you can go onto that on our website and see what's been happening in your local authority for pollinators. And again, it's a really good starting point just for finding out what's already happening on the ground. And I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to find out who your heritage or biodiversity officer is, because they're often the point of contact for the pollinator plan and biodiversity work generally. And they're really useful. They'll have loads of information about funding opportunities as well as the work that's going on. And they're just generally really useful people to have in your address book. So do find out who they are and make contact with them if you haven't already. We've got a guideline specifically for councils, which is also worth a read. Similar, generally the principles are the same, the recommendations that I've just shared with you, but there are differences. We tailor it slightly differently depending on the sector. So it's worth just getting familiar with that. And we're going to be updating this guideline next year. In fact, it is updated. We're going to be releasing it next year, which will include, again, a scoring system to help increase accountability and help councils assess their actions for pollinators and how well they're doing and what more they need to do. So in your wider community, there may well be already groups doing work for biodiversity, and these are just a small handful of initiatives that we're aware of. So there might be a Tidy Towns group who wants to work towards the Pollinator Award. That's one of the special awards that they run annually, particularly around taking actions for pollinators. There might be a GAA club involved in the Green Clubs programme. And that's a scheme, I think it was launched about this time last year. And it's where clubs can sign up to take action under 5 different headings. I think it's biodiversity, water and waste, climate and travel. And there's advice on their website on how to do that in the context of their sports club. Green Schools with Antashka. And new this year is the Irish Catholic Bishops' Conference Return to Nature initiative, which was announced in March. And the idea behind that is that they have agreed that 30% of all parishes, all parishes on the island of Ireland will return 30% of their church grounds to nature by 2030. So we're just starting to provide them with some support and help on that. But that's huge, and there may well be faith communities who are wanting to do that in your area. So work with others and find out who has similar goals, because you know yourselves that together you can have a bigger impact. And this is just one really lovely example before I wrap up. This is the Blarney Street Pollinator Pathway in Cork City. So there was a group of neighbours just after lockdown, one of the first lockdowns, who came up with an idea to create a pathway along their street in inner city Cork. And the idea was really simple. They visited all the neighbours and they asked them to pick a place, mow less and spray less. And they gave them these window stickers that they designed with the local artists. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but what it did is that it opened doors and it started conversations and it helped people get started on their biodiversity journey. Because often, you know yourselves, that's part of the struggle. It's getting people across the threshold who maybe haven't done anything before. There are ways to do that. That's a really lovely example. So there's, yeah, it's just a great, I suppose, case study in how sometimes really simple ideas can be really impactful. So I'm going to leave it there, but there are loads more resources on our website, including planting advice, guidelines for different sectors, free courses in identifying bumblebees, signage templates. I hope that's been helpful, and I'm just going to leave you with this thought. Pollinator numbers are still in decline on the island of Ireland, but what we're seeing is that local populations are increasing in places where action is being taken to help them. And that's the impact of communities who have decided to manage their landscape for pollinators. we know what we're doing is working. We just need to do it more. So thank you for listening. Thank you for having me. Best of luck with all your work. And if there's time, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was wonderful. I'm going to